appearance or the virtual invisibility in many places of the ulama. In a famous hadith says that Allah does not take ilm in one snatching, يَنْتَزِعُهُ مِنَ النَّاسِ, but He takes knowledge away through taking away the ulama, بِقَبْضِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. And as this happens, and the great scholars die, and they're not replaced by people who are of the same caliber, inevitably disunity starts to spread. One of the lamentable consequences of the war was the destruction of the manuscript collection in the Oriental Institute in Sarajevo. Those manuscripts were the heritage of almost 500 years of classical Sunni scholarship. And the largest single item in the catalogue was the Ijazatnameh literature. That is to say, like all traditional Orthodox Sunni Muslims, nobody could open his mouth in a mosque in Bosnia until very recently, unless he, or sometimes she, had been authorized to do so. The Ijazah is one of the great glories of our tradition. It's one of the guarantors of the close monitoring of the transmission of our texts. We do not just look things up by going to a library and opening a book, perhaps the translation of a book, and thinking that we know what it means, and then, even worse, going to the mosque and teaching that. On the contrary, first of all, we study the text with somebody who has himself studied the text, with somebody who has himself studied the text, and so it goes on back to the author of that book. And these ijazatnames, which are these beautiful calligraphed, inscribed things, were really at the very centre of traditional intellectual life in Bosnia, and it was those documents, more than anything else, that secured the intellectual coherence of traditional Bosnian Islam. Nowadays, unfortunately, with a few exceptions, it's very hard to find there somebody who is really authorized in the traditional way to teach a text. The new generation is not quite so erudite as the old generation. 45 years of communism certainly didn't help, because the madrasas were closed and the ulama were persecuted. And so now the Bosnian heart is open and vulnerable to new, more shallow, more ideological interpretations of the religion. And disunity has been the consequence. However, of course, in most parts of the Islamic world, alhamdulillah, the ulama are still very much with us. And the modern Muslim has the choice of either trying to adopt a do-it-yourself approach to interpreting religion, or studying at the hands of somebody who is accredited to do so. And this was the universal practice of Sunni Islam, generation after generation, and going right back to the time of the Sahaba, because it's nothing more than a continuation of the Isnad tradition, which goes right back to the very beginning of Islam. It's hard to imagine the Sahaba not conserving zealously the moments in their memories when they received the precious words from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when we study today, what we are doing is simply emulating their practice and the practice of the Tabi'in and the practice of the Atba' al-Tabi'in. So there are two great possibilities, it seems to me, amidst the confusions of today's ummah. There is the do-it-yourself approach, just look it up in a book that somebody or other has translated for whatever reason, and that is Islam, your Islam. Or to find a scholar who is authorized to teach. And unfortunately the former is a lot easier than the latter. And the former is more conformable to the spirit of the age, which tends to be individualistic and likes the personal individual touch, the individual conscience in authority over ancient texts. Submission to consensus is certainly not part of the modern ethos. So, on top of the dying away of the ulama, we have the problem of the all-pervasive modern ethos of people trying to figure things out for themselves, not accepting consensus, not accepting the traditional grey-bearded, wise authority with his ijazah certificate, but claiming that our interpretation is simply better and closer to the original sources. And I've had occasion to work quite closely with the ulama who do still maintain the classical tradition. And I've always been extraordinarily impressed by two things that we tend to lose sight of as we adopt the do-it-yourself method. The first thing is their extreme rigour. Unless they are absolutely sure that something is consensually regarded as a forbidden practice, they will never prevent anybody from doing it. And this is the way of Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, one of the great Imams of the Salaf, who said, if you find somebody who is doing a practice that you yourself consider to be haram, but you know that amongst the ulama there is some difference of opinion, it is forbidden for you to stop that person doing that thing. In other words, there's some scholar somewhere, an accredited scholar who has his isnad and has his ijazah, who thinks that it's not haram, then you leave it alone. You don't do it yourself, but you leave it alone. And that's something that I think we're losing sight of today as we work out our frustrations by pouncing on people who are doing things or thinking things that are different from what we happen to believe. So the real scrupulousness has been one aspect of it, but another aspect is the principle of mercy. One of my scholars used to say, the principal reason for studying Islamic law is to deepen one's appreciation of God's rahmah, His mercy. And the traditional scholar, as he takes you through the law, will be able to show point by point in the traditional, beautiful adab way how everything there is an expression of the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes in our interpretations of Sharia today, and our reinterpretations, we tend not to put the principle of mercy at the forefront. Sometimes it's some way down our list of priorities. Sometimes it doesn't seem to be invoked at all. So those are two things I've consistently found, a rigour and mercy. And the real scholar manifests both of those things simultaneously. But part of the rigour is something that again to our generation seems almost impossible to imagine. That is to say that in the process of ijtihad and giving fatwa, the method which is conventionally used by a younger generation and by ideological types of Islam is simply batil, it's invalid. And very often the people who are doing this kind of fiqh simply don't know what the consensus of the scholars say. And that's often because we don't know that the real Qur'an and the real Hadith is that which is memorized by the ulama. And then below that in degree comes the manuscripts which have themselves the sama'at, the teaching authorizations of the ulama which indicate that a text has been read to a particular scholar who says this text is actually a valid text of Bukhari, Muslim, whatever it might be. We don't think about the sama'at any longer. We tend to pick up printed editions and say this is the Sahih al-Bukhari on such and such a thing, therefore this is Allah's law. And that is a completely invalid fatwa. No classical Muslim scholar will valorize a fatwa given on the basis of a printed edition of the hadith. Completely impossible. Now why is this? One reason is that of course the printing process, which in the Arab world is typically quite decadent, it's businessmen in Beirut who want to turn a quick dinar, and so they get perhaps a manuscript from an older printed copy from the nearest mosque library and they just reproduce it cheaply, perhaps with footnotes but without really making sure of the text. The best it can manage is to provide one of the variant readings of the original source. So for instance, even the very best hadith collection that we have, which is printed, which is the Sultaniya edition of Sahih al-Bukhari, which was compared very carefully by the ulama at the time with the Yunini copy in the Egyptian National Library, which is the best copy of Bukhari, which has the sama'at of Hafiz al-Iraqi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and many other great muhaddiths, and is known to be a valid riwayah, narration of Imam al-Bukhari's Sahih. Even that has to prefer one of the readings over another. There are between 12 and 15 different versions of Sahih al-Bukhari. So Kushmayhani's reading has a different number of hadiths from Al-Tufi's reading, for instance. And some of the hadiths have differences in the isnads. There are subtle variations in the wording. So when you have this very post-traditional phenomenon of the text moving from the manuscript into a printed version of which thousands can be made, and it becomes a kind of standard imposed version for whoever happens to be picking it up in the bookshop, one of those readings has to be preferred. So usually when you get Bukhari, even if you get the good Sultaniya edition, which is very hard to get hold of, but even if you find it, or a modern cheap edition based on the Sultaniya edition, what you're getting is Kushmayhani's riwayah of al-Bukhari, from Firabri, from Imam al-Bukhari. One particular line of narration, but there are others. And it is not permissible to give fatwa on the basis of a single riwayah of a hadith collection. You have to know the others, obviously, because there are differences. There's a real danger of introducing innovations into Allah's religion. If all you bother to do is to get the printed edition of Bukhari that you picked up in the book fair or whatever it was, and look something up and say, well, this is what the hadith says. That's not Bukhari. That's a particular angle on Bukhari. That's not the original text. The original text is in the memory of the alim who can tell you the variants, the riwayat. So this is one example of how modernity has actually served us badly and how we've responded very badly to the introduction of the printing press. And we sometimes wonder why the ulama were so reluctant to allow printing in our countries. We know that the first Muslim printer was Ibrahim Mutafarriqa, the Hungarian Muslim in 17th century Istanbul. And the ulama successfully prevented from printing any religious text. He could do history text, geography text and the like, but not religious text. And that looks to us like some kind of pointless, reactionary, Luddite attitude. But in fact it was because you cannot encapsulate something like Bukhari in a printed text. According to the traditional standards of riwayah, of hadith narration, it cannot be done. And if you sit with really traditional scholars of hadith, of course they'll tell you this. They might have a printed copy that they're teaching from, but they will tell you to make corrections and things in the margin until it becomes very complicated and actually a very precious resource. And then eventually, when you've worked through it with them, they might give you ijazah to teach it. So that's another example of the decadence that has afflicted the ummah. The fact that we have, without thinking too carefully, assumed that the hadith collections are in the printed text. No classical alim would accept that. Another related problem is that very often these printed editions are not faithful reproductions of the original. And a lot of time is wasted on this. People find differences between different printed editions of Bukhari and Muslim and so forth in the Arab world, and they can't work out which is the right one. If they have access to the libraries, which are themselves administered in a very lazy and decadent way, and you pay the bribe and you go in and maybe you can see the original text, maybe it's been stolen, maybe it's on sale in some art dealer's place in New York, it's very decadent and typically third world, maybe you can work out what the original might be. Increasingly it's hard. And even with something like the Sultaniya edition of Bukhari, there are always going to be problems, and it's known to the ulama that there are problems with that printed edition. But with most of the others, you find catastrophes. For instance, I was working on a project for a proper critical edition of the Sahih al-Tirmidhi, and we found that there's never been a proper edition of Sahih al-Tirmidhi. You go into your bookshop in Mecca or wherever it might be, and there's plastic editions of Tirmidhi, perhaps with the commentaries. That's not the real thing at all. It's a catastrophe, full of mistakes, absolutely full of mistakes. Misprints, things left out, things put in the wrong order, big mess. So when we did the Tirmidhi, for instance, we found a whole block of 10 hadiths, which are there in all the old manuscripts and in the memories of the ulama who have the ijazah, not in any of the printed editions of Tirmidhi. It's just typical third world decadence. We're currently, our current project with the Hadith project which I'm involved with at Al-Azhar is the issuing for the first time of a critical edition of the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. And again here we found very disappointing things. The Saudis paid $22 million to a Syrian scholar to produce a proper edition of the Musnad because the earlier ones were very problematic. But we found that actually his effort is inadequate again. And we found that our edition has more than 250 more hadiths than any of the printed editions. For no reason other than the fact that nobody really traditionally has been bothered to spend the time going back to the manuscripts and talking to the great shuyukh who have the ijazahs to find out what is the proper riwayah of the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And this, of course, has major consequences. If you talk to Sheikh Ahmad Ma'bad, who's the greatest muhaddith in Egypt at the moment, who's responsible for this project for editing the hadith for the first time, he'll say, really, classically speaking, any of the fatwas that have appeared from the Islamic fiqh academies in Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the last 50 or 60 years can be regarded as binding on Muslims, because in most cases, he says, they actually use printed copies of the hadith rather than the ijazas or the manuscripts. And that's a very big criticism, but unfortunately that's the state of the modern Middle East. So that's just an example of what we're up against. Commercial exploitation and cynicism, the absence of proper institutions, university presses in the Muslim world, very unusual, unlike most places in the world. Large academic charities that are happy to spend large sums of money and decades on producing a fair copy